What's up everyone, Thralls here once again. I'm Necrotic Nick, and I have yet another album review for you. So, another one that came out on the 19th of November, busy fucking week, was the latest offering from Pathology, The Everlasting Plague. This comes out on Nuclear Blast Records, their first release on Nuclear Blast Records, I believe. This band formed in 2006 in San Diego, California. This is their 11th full-length, and interesting thing about their discography, they pretty much only have full lengths. There are no EPs, no live albums, no compilations, no splits. They just put out full lengths. That is pretty much it. These guys are brutal death metal veterans featuring current and former members of Cattle Decapitation, Inherent Disease, Condemned, and Lord of War. And this is a little bit different than what I expected. I actually have a couple of Pathology albums, and they are straightforward brutal death. I mean, pretty much all the hallmarks of it. Big slam riffs, big guttural, gurgled vocals, occasionally pig growls. Not a big fan of that. But outright brutality pretty much at all times. This actually spares some of the brutality in favor of melody. But before you get to that first offering on A Pound of Flesh, you have to get past the intro, which the intro, maybe it was intended to be like kind of dark and creepy and ominous, but it kind of sounds like the beginning of a show that's probably a lot like NCIS. It kind of feels like that. Like, there's no part of it that really feels like, you know, ominous at all, or like, you know, horror themed. It just feels like I'm about to watch something that Gary Sinise may or may not be in. But that gives way to brutal chugging, blast beats, guttural vocals that are absolutely filthy. Kind of not really my style. It just sounds like he's kind of throwing up inside of a paper towel tube. I'm not really big on that vocal style, and it is, I would say, the only vocal style in here, unless he switches to a more pig growl, which I'm not a fan of that either. In fact, I'm less of a fan of that. But for brutal death metal, that is pretty much the style, so kind of let it pass. But within the song are some elements that did not necessarily sound like Pathology, and that even continues to the next track, Perpetual Torment. Melody, like a pretty fair amount of it. In fact, there's a lot of riffs on here that would not sound out of place on like a melodic death metal record, like something by Hypocrisy or At the Gates. In fact, there's even some really cool tapping solos, and all the leads on here have a lot of melody. They're not like just squealy dive bombs and, you know, just ferocious shredding that really isn't super tuneful. A lot of it is very tuneful, and a lot of the riffs have big, you know, melodic hooks, but they're kind of powerful hooks, but they definitely don't sound like your standard brutal death stuff. In fact, it wasn't until I got down to the track Viciously Defiled that it really sounded a lot like Pathology, at least the Pathology that I'm used to. You know, straightforward, brutal death metal, big slam riffs in there, you know, it's heavier than hell, blast beats all around, and the riffs are not really melodic at all. In fact, that is probably the most straightforward, brutal song on there that really doesn't have much of a hint of melody, or at least nothing that comes off as mellow deathish. Loads of triplet chugs. I would even say there's kind of that like Pat O'Brien kind of like ultra chuggy riffing on there with some really cool pinch harmonics. It's a flat out brutal song, but it's kind of surrounded by a lot of songs that really experiment with melody. I would almost call this brutal mellow death? Mellow brutal death? I don't know. Neither one of those really quite makes sense to me, but part of me kind of likes what they're doing on here, because brutal death is kind of centered in on one particular sound. Like, it's just brutality out front. The riff work kind of does get a little bit similar on a lot of brutal death metal work. Like, they love the palm muted chugs, triplet chugs, slam breaks, occasional tremolo riffs, but most of the time it's just a chugathon. This kind of breaks up with a lot of melody and some interesting dynamics along the way. The song As the Entrails Wither, which I wasn't aware that entrails could wither. I thought they would just rot first, but okay, maybe that takes place afterwards. Either way, opens up with clean guitars and lots of melody. It's actually really pretty, which is generally a word that I just chuck the fuck out of most reviews for brutal death metal. But it's actually a really cool dynamic opening. It opens a little bit slower, a little bit more groove laden. There's actually some melodies on here earlier in the album that kind of remind me a bit of Bolt Thrower, just with a more brutal death guitar tone. But this song does build in the beginning. Like, it has a really cool, like, kind of vibe. It's kind of like a charge into war. And this is the longest song on the album at 4 minutes and 41 seconds, I believe. Most of these songs are in that 3-minute range, and they kind of keep everything really condensed. This one kind of broadens it out, but they kind of go for the standard fare in terms of brutal death in between there. And I feel like this was a chance to do maybe something maybe vastly different, because there is a fair amount of experimentation with melody on here. Like, melody is literally on almost every track on here. But I feel like when they feel like they're getting too melodic, like too much of a push to one side, they kind of go back to the safe spot of just outright brutality. And I think they do some of it really well. It's just, I don't think they're really like fully exploring that side. But honestly, it is kind of far removed from what they usually do. So maybe one of those things that's best saved for a side project. I don't know, this album I thought was going to be very straightforward. Like, I pretty much thought I knew what to expect out of this, and I do like the fact that I was surprised, but some of it is kind of colliding with one another in terms of, like, the battle of styles here. Now, when it comes to the production here, I think the production's pretty tight, like, maybe a tad too compressed, but it does kind of have just that sort of brutal death sound. No pingy snare, but man, the drums are really out front. Like, you can hear that snare pop pretty loudly. And the drum work really kind of reminds me a lot of like Cannibal Corpse. Like, it kind of has that sort of like static Cannibal Corpse blast beat. It's just powerful. And there are loads of groovy sections on here too. Both kind of in the realm, again, of like more standard old school death metal, melodic death metal, and of course, brutal death metal. And the big, more epic intros kind of took over towards the back half. They kind of all ended up having that from as the intros Wither, of course, and Dirge for the Infected and Death Ritual Deciphered. All of them kind of start off with a big, kind of slow, grand, epic, and then they shift again into what you would expect from Pathology, more along the lines of brutal death metal. And each one of those, I kind of wanted to hear a little bit more of that more groovy style sort of take over, just because they were doing really good with it. A lot of this, they already kind of covered that brutal death and quasi-melodic death sort of sound in there. There's only one song in here I'd say that is more just kind of groove-laden across the board, and that's Disease Morality, which honestly kind of sounds like a brutal death sort of tribute to Bolt Thrower. Like, it really kind of locks on that groove and just remains heavy as hell. Now, as for issues with this album, do have a few. Again, the vocals kind of put me off, and I think there's a little bit more reasoning behind this other than I just don't like brutal death metal vocals for the most part. There's a lot of variety in the music. They're trying a lot of different things, but the vocals are kind of flatlined on just straight up brutal death metal. If all the material on here was more similar to Viciously Defiled, which I think is like the heaviest track on there, like the no bullshit, we're not going to throw in any melody at all, I think the vocals would be fine. I wouldn't be into them, but they would fit the music. This, there's a lot of melody and, again, a lot of just other stuff that's sort of coming in here. And just like a high scream every now and then I think would break it up. Because overall this album's vibe kind of sits somewhere between Dying Fetus and Black Dahlia Murder, and I think you just need a little bit more vocal variety there just to sort of break up the delivery on there. And I kind of have a little bit of an issue with the last track, Decomposition of Millions. This feels like an extra. It's an instrumental, and it feels like a mid-2000s metalcore song. It feels nothing like really anything on here. Like, the melody is not necessarily mellow death this time, and when it comes down to the breakdown, it's not like a slam breakdown. It feels like metalcore. Like, it feels like this could have been on like an Unearth album or something like that. Not that I have a problem with Unearth, I still like those guys, but this is Pathology. And again, it kind of fits in that weird experimentation thing that I think is going on here, but this one just feels like something left over for a different project, or this was something that the frontman just really, his vocals wouldn't fit on it, so they just did it as an instrumental. I don't think it's necessarily bad, but the style comparison to the rest of the album is pretty jarring. And to make matters, I don't know if worse is the word, but not great, they kind of had this long-winded outro at the end of this last track too, which kind of sounds like the intro, which I guess that's the end credits for the Gary Sinise, maybe he was in it, maybe he wasn't, movie, TV show, miniseries I was watching, not really watching. I don't know, it felt kind of weird. But overall though, I mean, this is kind of a weird album, at least for me, at least in terms of what I was expecting, but I think it's pretty decent, honestly. It doesn't necessarily like fit fully into brutal death metal, but I mean, I think this is the place you put them because it's Pathology. It's very strange just hearing this much melody in a brutal death metal band, especially since I've listened to this band before and I know how heavy they can be, which is ungodly heavy. But I think this makes for, I don't know, an interesting listen, and I kind of wonder how much more they're going to pursue this sound in the future. So overall, I'm going to give this 3 stars. I think it's pretty good. I like a lot of the melodies. I think they really add a lot. You know, it's just interesting hearing a band that sounds a fuck ton like Gorgasm also sound like Hypocrisy. The lead work is super melodic. There are catchy riffs throughout this entire album, and it still gets brutal as fuck when it needs to be. Sometimes the sounds do kind of collide, and some of the transitions to the more melodic stuff can be a little odd, but overall I think they executed it pretty well, and this kind of stands out in their discography, which honestly their discography, I mean, you could say it kind of sounds like a lot of the same stuff. Not bad, because I mean, you know, Cannibal Corpse has a lot of stuff that sounds very similar, and I love them, but just very similar. This album definitely stands out for some pretty interesting reasons, and I kind of wonder what the future holds for this band in terms of like pushing further in a melodic direction, becoming a more like well-rounded just death metal band and kind of escaping the brutal death metal banner, or they return to flat out brutal death metal glory in the future. Who knows? I mean, clearly they can do all this pretty damn well. I would like to hear more vocal variety just because there's more variety in the music again. But overall, I mean, if you're a fan of Pathology, note that this is a little bit different, I think. But overall, you're still going to get all the brutality you want. You're just going to get some more melodic hooks. So, I mean, if you like your brutality with a spot of melody, I would say definitely check this one out. So, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you are new to the channel, subscribe, because we do stuff like this all the time. We are also on Patreon. There is a link down below if you would like to help us out there. We also still have shirts for sale. If you would like one, hit us up on thrallsmetal@gmail.com. Send us a message, put shirts in it. We will get back to you and hopefully sell you a shirt. We are looking to expand our catalog a little bit in terms of merch. So if you guys have some suggestions, we would love to hear them, because ultimately this stuff is for you and we would like to know what you would like. So your input would be greatly appreciated, because, well, you guys are the reason we do this stuff, because you guys have been awesome to us. So from the bottom of my heart, once again, thank you all for watching, and we will catch you later.